One step closer to crisis. I'm Michael Smerconish in Philadelphia. Early this morning, the U.S. Supreme Court blocked deportations by the Trump administration of at least 30 alleged Venezuelan gang members who immigration advocates say were at imminent risk of being removed. Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, they dissented. The administration was preparing to again rely on the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. That's a wartime statute, heretofore rarely invoked, that was the basis for President Trump's deportation of more than 130 Venezuelans on March 15th. The action by the Supreme Court, it caps a week in which President Trump has been on the wrong side of three high-profile issues, none of which have seemed to cost him politically. But that might be about to change. On Tuesday, I tweeted this: 3 stories dominate the news. In each, Donald Trump wrong on the merits, but benefiting politically. Number 1, defunding Harvard. Number 2, not facilitating the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Number 3, reducing the IRS workforce by 40%. Wrong, wrong, and wrong. Cheers, applause, USA, USA. Issue 1, Harvard. The New York Times is reporting today that an emailed letter from the Trump administration, which set off this tectonic battle between one of the country's most prestigious universities and a U.S. president, was actually sent in error. How that will impact the current battle, that remains to be seen. I have no doubt that the university was flat-footed in initially responding to anti-Semitism that followed the Israeli response to the Hamas attack of 10/7. But that's not why the administration froze $2.2 billion in funding, or why the IRS is contemplating revoking the university's tax-exempt status. Ordering Harvard to ensure, quote, viewpoint diversity in each department, field, or teaching unit might be a worthy goal if it's directed by the Board of Trustees. But coming from the federal government, it's a gross overreach of power. And by the way, it's completely at odds with old school conservatism. And most of what Trump is seeking to impose on Harvard, it's got nothing to do with protecting Jewish students. To the contrary, consider Jacob Miller, Harvard class of 2025, former Harvard Hillel president, former editorial chair of the Crimson. He wrote this: anyone familiar with campus life knows funding cuts will have little effect on Jews' experience at Harvard besides degrading the quality of research and instruction. Worse, they could set back research significantly and destabilize the academy, one of the institutions in which Jews have historically thrived. Ditto Yair Rosenberg, writing in The Atlantic, quote, in reality, Donald Trump and his allies have been using anti-Semitism as a pretext to advance a radical agenda that has nothing at all to do with Jews and that most American Jews do not support. So what's the real aim here? The real aim is the further dismantling of those spheres of opposition to this administration. First, it was big law. Second, it was the big media. And now it's the most elite of academia. So you're thinking, that means this is a losing issue politically for the president? Hardly. This is a fight that he relishes. Trump might be vulnerable waging such a war against a state university, think Penn State or Michigan State. But Harvard's a much less sympathetic target, perceived in the heartland as a bastion of both elitism and liberalism. Trump, wrong on the merits, right on the politics. Issue 2, Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Born in El Salvador, entered the U.S. in 2011 illegally. When he was 16 years old, last month he was arrested in Baltimore and deported back to El Salvador, where he was at first housed in that notorious terrorism confinement center, the largest prison in Latin America. Maximum security built to hold gang members. He's since been moved to another location, another prison. The administration originally admitted mistakes in his deportation, but now they defend their decision. To the Trump White House, Abrego Garcia, he's a dangerous criminal. He had hearings in 2019, found by 2 judges to be a member of MS-13 gang. In addition, they now note that he has a history of domestic violence and is suspected as a human trafficker. His deportation, according to this view, in 2025, if anything, long overdue. To his defenders, he's a law-abiding man with deep roots in this country, married to a U.S. citizen, raising 3 kids, never been charged with a crime while living here, and the evidence that he's a gang member, they say, that's thin. No matter which take you believe, it seems pretty clear he was denied due process We know in 2019 he argued he was likely to suffer persecution if returned to El Salvador and was granted withholding of removal status, which protected him against deportation to his native land. Yet, despite what the courts said then and reaffirmed in 2025, he was wrongly deported to El Salvador. So, that means it's a losing issue politically for the president, right? No. Again, this is a fight he relishes. As Harry Enton notes, deportations are popular.
Back in 2016, just 38% of voters wanted the government to try to deport all 11 million undocumented immigrants. Compared to where we are in 2025, 56%, the majority. The American people have come a long way on this issue, much closer to Donald Trump, and I think that's a big part of the reason why Americans are increasingly saying the country is on the right track when it comes to immigration policy, and why Donald Trump's net approval rating on that issue is in the positive.
The Democrats' approach to the issue is symbolized by Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen's trip this week to El Salvador to check on Abrego Garcia's health and well-being. They met, and Van Hollen tweeted, "I have called his wife Jennifer to pass along his message of love." Meanwhile, while Van Hollen was in El Salvador this week, Patty Morin was invited to the White House. She's a Marylander. She's a Maryland citizen. Her daughter, Rachel, was killed by another migrant from El Salvador, a crime for which he was convicted on Monday. Rachel Morin's murder left 5 children motherless. Check this out. This is the New York Post from Thursday with coverage of that White House meeting. Patty Morin said that Senator Van Hollen barely acknowledged her daughter's execution. So was Abrego Garcia denied due process? And will that politically harm the president? Not when Abrego Garcia is sharing a split screen with Patty Morin. President Trump, wrong on the merits, right on the politics. Issue 3, the IRS. This week we learned the administration is seeking to slash personnel. CBS reported that the IRS is planning to cut up to 40% of its workforce after Tuesday marked the official end of tax filing season. According to an internal memo, it said that the IRS will send a reduction in force, a RIF notice, on a biweekly basis. The RIF plan also states the agency will go from 102,000 employees to its targeted ending figures of 60,000 to 70,000. News of the memo was first reported by the Federal News Network. There's nothing wrong in principle with downsizing government. No large organization is perfectly run, and a streamlined federal workforce could arguably cost less without any loss in efficiency. But here's the thing. The nation has more than $36 trillion in debt. And a reduction in IRS personnel will mean even fewer audits, with audits already in decline. A New York Times analysis published this week showed that the IRS audit rate has been lower this decade than in most taxpayers' lifetimes. The rate for individual taxpayers has decreased by about 2/3 since just 2010. Not surprisingly, lower audit rates mean less government revenue. Arguably, Trump's policies will put the U.S. further in debt. So that means it's a losing issue politically for the president, right? No. What politician wants to argue for the ability of the IRS to conduct audits? The Biden administration tried to do that. Again, it's a fight he relishes, even though he's struggling to justify continuation of the 2017 tax cuts while trying to extend relief to the working class, many of whom voted for him. Harvard, Abrego Garcia, the IRS. When might the merits and the politics align? Well, each of these issues is now being litigated. And while the court outcomes remain uncertain, one thing is clear. Americans overwhelmingly still value the rule of law. When recently asked if the president should obey court rulings even when he disagrees with them, 82% said yes. And that includes 97% of Democrats and 68% of Republicans. It used to be an article of faith that a U.S. president would obey a court order, like the court order issued this morning by the Supreme Court blocking deportations of certain Venezuelans currently in Texas. But it remains to be seen how the Trump administration is going to respond. Kilmar Abrego Garcia was not removed from the U.S. under the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. Nevertheless, In the face of legal challenges to his removal, the White House rewrote a New York Times headline yesterday, and then they tweeted it out. The headline, as originally written in the Times, said this: Maryland senator meets with wrongly deported Maryland man in El Salvador. The White House version: senator meets with deported MS-13 illegal alien in El Salvador who's never coming back. So what's to come? Erwin Chemerinsky is the dean of the Berkeley School of Law, a frequent guest of mine here. Writing for the LA Times this week, Dean Chemerinsky said this: until now, I did not appreciate how much our constitutional democracy depends on the good faith of those who govern us to comply with the law, including court orders. Are there sufficient guardrails to protect us when an administration will not comply? Will we continue to be a nation under the rule of law? We shall see. Wrong on the merits, right on the politics. But for how long?